Why would a man laugh while leaving someone to die under the open sun? That question would echo in Jenny Carter's head long after the desert fell silent. The cartel lieutenant thought he was clever when he tossed her from the back of his truck, a plume of dust rising behind him as if erasing her from existence. The moment the engine faded into the distance, the world became terrifyingly quiet. Just wind, heat, and the endless shimmer of sand. He'd left her zip-tied, kneeling in the dust with no water, no shade, no gear, and no witnesses. "You dealt a force," he had said in his thickly accented English, standing over her as she squinted up at him through the glare. "Always so tough, so elite, but even the elite need water, yes." His laughter was dry and cruel, the kind of sound that didn't echo. "Let's see how tough you are after 3 days under that sun. Maybe you crawl back, maybe you beg, maybe you just die." And then he was gone. Jenny stayed still for several seconds, breathing through her nose, her lips already dry. The wind scoured across her face like sandpaper. The desert stretched in every direction, colorless, endless. The air shimmered at 118 degrees and climbing. Her throat was already closing. Her heart didn't race. Her breathing didn't quicken, because she knew panic was what killed first, not the heat. Her tactical mind was already running the numbers. 6 hours ago, her team had been ambushed. The cartel had seized her M4, her sidearm, her radio, GPS, everything. They'd taken her plate carrier, her gear, even her canteen. They stripped away every tool that made her a soldier. What they didn't realize was that those weren't what made her dangerous. Training did. And the refusal to quit. The sun sat northwest, maybe 2 in the afternoon. 5 hours before sunset, 8 before full darkness. Her team had been captured and taken east, about 90 kilometers if her internal calculations were right. 90 kilometers of open desert, 90 kilometers of death. But distance was only part of the problem. Time was the real enemy. In this heat without water, a normal person would be dead in 3 hours. Jenny Carter was not normal. The lieutenant's last words lingered in the air. "You die alone out here." She waited until the dust cloud of the departing truck became nothing more than a smudge on the horizon. Then she moved. Her wrists burned as she twisted against the zip ties. They were industrial-grade, thick plastic, designed to restrain even the strongest person. Breaking them by force was impossible, but Jenny didn't need brute force. Delta selection had taught her something else, how to dislocate her own thumb without hesitation. She flexed, angled her left wrist, then jerked sharply. The joint popped with a muted snap that made her eyes water. She exhaled through her teeth, slid her smaller hand free, and twisted the plastic loop until it snapped. Freedom, the kind that hurt. She rose slowly, scanning her surroundings. The Sierra Mars desert stretched like a sea of fire. The horizon wavered, no signs of life. No trees, no shade, no water. But where others would see emptiness, she saw clues. Creosote bushes, small, greenish-brown shrubs scattered across the sand, often grew where water once flowed underground. Barrel cacti dotted the landscape, storing drinkable moisture. She could hear faint chirping in the distance. Insects meant life. Life meant water. She crouched, running her fingers through the sand, feeling its texture, coarse, dry, and hot enough to burn skin. Beneath it, maybe a few feet down, the temperature would drop. That meant there was some residual moisture below the surface. Not enough to drink, but enough to work with. The lieutenant thought he'd buried her in a grave. What he'd done was drop her into the one environment she understood best. Because Jenny Carter had grown up in Phoenix, a child of dust, heat, and unforgiving sun. She knew what deserts did to people who underestimated them, and she'd spent years training for moments exactly like this. She shaded her eyes, staring toward the east where the horizon blurred into ridgelines. 90 kilometers. Her team was out there, captured, maybe tortured. She had to reach them. But to reach them, she first had to survive the next 5 hours. She tore a strip from her undershirt and wrapped it around her head, creating a crude sun barrier. The move felt instinctual, not comfort, just survival. Every shadow mattered. Every degree of cooling meant another heartbeat longer to think. Jenny moved toward the nearest creosote bush, dropped to her knees, and began to dig. The sand burned against her palms, but she didn't stop. She dug until the surface gave way to cooler soil. There, dampness, faint but real. She took her uniform top, buried it in the cool sand, then pulled it back out, pressing it to her skin. The evaporation would cool her blood and buy her time. Time, the most precious thing in the desert. By 4 p.m. the heat peaked. The light became almost white, sharp enough to sting her eyes. She had to stay low. The dunes rippled in the distance like waves under invisible fire. She began to move east, one slow, measured step at a time, packing her breathing, counting each stride to conserve energy. Her tongue felt like sandpaper. Her throat burned. But she forced herself to think, not feel. Every sensation became data. Every pain a signal. Every drop of sweat a loss she had to minimize. At 5 p.m. a shadow passed overhead, a vulture, circling lazily. She smiled faintly through cracked lips. "Not yet," she muttered under her breath. Talking to herself felt almost comforting in the silence. "Come back tomorrow." The desert had its own language, subtle, ruthless, ancient. Jenny could read it, the direction of the wind, the color of the sky. The scent of dust carried from miles away. She adjusted her route toward the southeast, following the faint slope of terrain where animal tracks etched faint paths. Rabbits, maybe coyotes. They always moved toward water at dusk. The sun began to sink. The color of the desert shifted from white to gold, then to the color of rusted blood. Jenny stopped at a small rise and turned back to look at her footprints. They vanished quickly under the wind. Good. No one would track her, not easily. She felt the exhaustion creeping in, but under it was something stronger, a memory. A voice from years ago during Delta selection training, echoing across the cold mountains of North Carolina. "You don't survive because you're stronger. You survive because you stay calm when everyone else panics." Her instructor had said it while watching her drag a 50-pound rucksack through a flooded ravine. At the time, she'd thought he was talking about endurance. Now she understood it was about mindset. The desert didn't care how strong you were. It only cared how long you could keep thinking clearly while dying slowly. By 6:30 p.m. the light softened. The first relief of evening spread across the dunes. The air cooled slightly, dropping into the 90s, still hot but bearable. She found another creosote bush, dug in beside it, and waited for the sun to fall completely. The stars would guide her once darkness came. As she sat there, she allowed herself a few seconds to breathe, to let her mind wander, but only a few. She thought about her team, Colonel Hale, Logan Pierce, Nova, the others. Were they still alive? Had the cartel started interrogations? She pictured them bound, beaten, forced to give up intel. The thought hit her chest like a weight. "They're counting on you," she whispered. The desert wind carried her words away. When the first stars appeared, she stood again. Her legs ached, her lips were bleeding, but the cooler air gave her a second life. She oriented herself by the North Star and began walking east, step by step, quiet, controlled, focused. Each hour brought new challenges: loose sand, hidden rocks, sharp thorns that tore at her boots. She stumbled once, catching herself before falling. Pain lanced up her side. She gritted her teeth and kept moving. Sometime past midnight, she reached a shallow ridge overlooking a canyon. Below, the faint sound of dripping water reached her ears. She froze. Could it be? She crouched low, scanning the shadows. There, a narrow trickle along a rock face, glowing faintly in starlight. She moved carefully down the slope, testing every step. When she reached the base, she knelt, cupping her hands beneath the slow trickle, and drank. The water was gritty, mineral-heavy, but the taste was salvation. She drank slowly. She knew better than to gulp. The desert punished greed. Her body trembled as life returned in small doses. She rested there, back against the cool stone, eyes half closed. The canyon was silent except for the faint hiss of wind. For the first time since being thrown from the truck, she let herself feel not fear, not anger, just something quieter. Relief. Gratitude. But rest was a luxury. She couldn't stay long. She tore a strip from her sleeve, soaked it, and tied it around her neck. Every drop mattered. Then she looked up at the stars again, calculating her next move. She had water now. Next, she needed tools. The canyon walls offered plenty: rocks, dry wood, cactus ribs. She found a piece of flint-like stone and began chipping it carefully against another, creating a sharp edge. Then she stripped fibers from a dead saguaro skeleton to form bindings. Piece by piece, she built the beginnings of survival, crude, ugly, but functional. When dawn approached, the sky bled pale orange. She retreated deeper into the canyon to escape the rising sun. She dug a shallow pit in the sand, buried herself halfway, and covered the top with her dampened shirt. The temperature dropped just enough to keep her from overheating. She drifted into light sleep, dreams fading in and out, flashes of her team, of gunfire, of laughter from a briefing room in Prescott, Arizona. That's where it had begun. The mission that went wrong. The decision that led her here. And in that haze of exhaustion, she could still hear Colonel Hale's voice from that briefing. Trust your training. If things go sideways, use it. Things had gone sideways. And now, the desert was her battlefield. The sun rose higher. Heat built again. Jenny stirred awake, her body sore but mind clear. She opened her eyes to a wall of light, white and merciless. She took a slow breath, feeling the ache in her ribs, the throb in her burned skin, and the grit between her teeth. The lieutenant thought she'd beg. He thought she'd crawl. He thought she'd die. But as Jenny Carter stood again, squinting toward the horizon, she knew something he never would. You can't kill a Delta operator by taking her gear. You have to take her will, and hers was still intact. And somewhere beyond that line of shimmering heat, her team was waiting. Why was everyone so quiet in that briefing room? Jenny Carter remembered that silence more than anything else, the hum of the flickering projector, the sound of someone's pen tapping against a folder, the heavy air thick with heat and unspoken tension. It was 3 days before the ambush, 3 days before the desert tried to bury her. The Prescott Operations Building wasn't impressive: cinderblock walls, faded government paint, and an air conditioner that fought a losing battle against the Arizona heat. Inside, a handful of elite soldiers sat in folding chairs around a long table. Maps and satellite imagery covered the walls. One screen displayed grainy recon photos of a compound in northern Mexico, near the Sierra Mars desert. At the head of the table stood a man in a government-issue suit, sleeves rolled up, tie loosened. He looked like he hadn't slept in weeks. Agent Quinn Mercer, he'd introduced himself. Department doesn't matter. What matters is the target. The photos changed: a cluster of structures surrounded by fencing and vehicles, a well in the middle, guard towers on each corner. Valdez Cartel's main distribution hub, Mercer said. They're funneling fentanyl through here, enough to kill 10 million people a month. We've tried to hit them through DEA channels. No success. Too fortified, too well-armed. Jenny had leaned forward slightly, her eyes narrowing. The satellite images were sharp enough to show weapon caches, sandbag positions, a perimeter road. She noted every detail. "Why us?" she asked, her tone calm, almost indifferent. Mercer looked at her, then at the man beside her, Colonel Mason Hale, Delta Force commander, built like a statue of controlled violence. "Because," Mercer said quietly, "they have American hostages, taken from a border town last week. The cartel's using them as leverage. The locals can't move on them without casualties. You can." The room went still. Jenny felt that word, hostages, sink in. She'd seen what cartel captivity meant. She'd seen the videos, and she'd vowed she'd never let it happen on her watch. Colonel Hale crossed his arms. "What's the threat level?" Mercer clicked to another slide. Dozens of fighters, ex-military, ex-contractors, foreign veterans. They've got belt feds, RPGs, and possibly man-portable SAMs. It's not just a cartel, it's a militia. Staff Sergeant Logan Pierce, heavy weapons expert, grunted. Sounds like a fun vacation. Jenny didn't smile. What about terrain? Mercer adjusted the map. You're looking at the Sierra Mars Desert. Hot, dry, wide open. Daytime temps hit 120. Nothing but rock, sand, and bad decisions for miles. Only reliable water source is inside the compound. A deep well. Jenny's voice came steady, precise. So that's their lifeline. Mercer nodded. Exactly, which means if we cut it, they come to us thirsty and desperate. She glanced around the table. Some of the men shifted in their seats, already feeling the desert in their throats. Jenny, on the other hand, felt a strange familiarity. She, grown up in this heat. She understood it the way others understood cold, as an old enemy you respected, not feared. When the meeting ended, Colonel Hale found her alone in the prep room, methodically stripping and reassembling her M4. "You're worried about something," he said. "I'm worried about everything," she replied without looking up. "That's why I'm still breathing." Hale studied her for a moment, then said quietly, "You ever think the desert feels alive?" She paused. "It's not alive, sir. It just doesn't care. That's what makes it dangerous." He nodded slowly. "Fair point." Jenny snapped the bolt back into place, her movements clean, practiced, deliberate. The M4 wasn't a weapon to her, it was a ritual. Every click and snap centered her mind. She cleaned gear the way some people prayed. That night she couldn't sleep. She lay on her bunk staring at the ceiling, the hum of the air conditioner barely masking her thoughts. She kept replaying the satellite images, the compound, the well, the endless dunes around it. 90 kilometers of exposure. No trees, no cover. If anything went wrong, there would be nowhere to hide. But she trusted her team. She trusted her training. And she trusted herself. Still, something about this mission felt wrong. Too clean, too convenient. The kind of op where the intel always turned out to be incomplete. 2 nights later, they inserted. The helicopter cut low across the desert under cover of darkness, rotor wash scattering sand like smoke. Jenny felt the vibration in her chest. She loved that feeling, the moment before silence, before chaos. It was the heartbeat of every operation. 30 seconds, the crew chief shouted. She tightened her gear straps, checked her optics, and met Hale's eyes across the cabin. No words were needed. They'd done this too many times. The helicopter dropped to a hover and they jumped, boots sinking into warm sand. The aircraft banked away, its sound fading into nothing. Just them and the night. They moved fast, Delta style. No chatter, no wasted movement. Each operator spaced perfectly, their shapes blending into the darkness. The desert at night was deceptive, cooler, yes, but still suffocating. The heat radiated from the ground like the breath of something sleeping beneath the earth. Jenny led the overwatch element. Her job, set up a sniper position, provide cover, eyes on. The others, Hale, Logan, Nova, formed the assault team that would breach the compound once she signaled clear lanes. They reached the observation ridge 2 hours before dawn. Jenny dropped to prone, scanning through her scope. There it was, the compound, glowing faintly under starlight. 3 main buildings, guard towers, floodlights, vehicle bay. Men with rifles patrolling in lazy circles, confident no one could reach them here. Through her earpiece, Hale's voice came low. "Sniper 1, report. Eyes on, 2 sentries west, 1 north tower. Shift change in 10. Recommend breach in 12. Copy that." Jenny's heartbeat slowed. Her breathing matched the rhythm of her trigger finger. Calm, controlled. She was in her element. The world narrowed to lines of sight, timing, distance, and wind. The guard shift changed exactly as predicted. 2 men crossed the yard, talking. Jenny squeezed the trigger once. The suppressed shot cracked quietly. 1 down, the other froze, second shot, another soft pop. Both bodies dropped into shadow. "Clear," she whispered. The assault team moved, ghosts in the dark. They crossed the open ground fast, reaching the outer wall. Charges set. Detonation muffled. They slipped inside, rifles up, clearing corners. It was smooth, almost too smooth. And then chaos. A voice shouted in Spanish. A light flared. Jenny pivoted her scope just as a hidden patrol stepped out from a gully no one knew existed. 4 men, then 8. Spotlights swung. The compound erupted. "Contact front," Logan's voice crackled through comms. Muzzle flashes lit the dark like lightning. Bullets tore through sand and air. Jenny exhaled once, firing in rhythm. 1, 2, 3 precise shots, clean hits, but there were too many. Alarms screamed. The element of surprise vanished in seconds. "Fall back," Hale barked. They began to withdraw, covering one another in bursts, but the enemy had numbers and home ground advantage. "Flanking left," Nova shouted. "We're boxed in." Jenny scanned the terrain, ridgelines, angles, firing arcs. Her brain ran scenarios faster than thought. They walked into a textbook encirclement, and there was only one way to break it. "I'll draw them off," she said into the comms. "Negative," Hale snapped. "We stay together." "If we stay, we die together," she countered. "You know I'm right." She was already moving before he could reply. She fired a controlled burst, then sprinted north, breaking from cover. The cartel fighters turned toward the noise instantly. Their spotlights followed her like hungry eyes. "Jenny," Hale's voice roared through static, "that's a long march through open desert." "I know," she said between breaths. "Buy them time." She ran until her lungs burned, diving behind a sand ridge, returning fire in bursts just enough to keep them chasing. Trucks roared to life behind her, engines snarling. Searchlights carved the night. Dozens of men after one woman. Somewhere behind, Hale's voice came through faintly. "All elements withdraw. Jenny bought us time, don't waste it." She heard it, smiled grimly, and pushed harder. The desert stretched out like a punishment. For hours she ran, ducked, hid, fired, moved again. She used every inch of terrain, every shadow. The pursuit was relentless. The sound of engines grew louder, then fainter, then closer again. They were hunting her now, not just to kill her, but to make a point. No one escaped the Valdez cartel. Near dawn, they finally cornered her, a canyon too narrow to climb out of. She turned, rifle ready, one magazine left. She fired until it clicked empty. Then she drew her sidearm, 2 more down, another step closer. Click, empty again. They overwhelmed her with sheer numbers. Hands grabbed her arms, twisted them behind her. Someone struck her across the face with a rifle butt. Her vision flashed white. Voices shouted. Laughter. The taste of blood filled her mouth. Then blackness. When she woke, she was in the back of a truck, wrists bound, head throbbing. The sun was already up, burning through thin fabric. A man leaned over her, the lieutenant, eyes cold and amused. "You fought well," he said, "but everyone breaks." He gave an order. The truck stopped. They dragged her out and threw her into the sand. "This is your grave, Delta," he said. "No water, no hope." He turned, climbed into the truck, and drove away. Jenny lay there, chest heaving, the sound of the engine fatting until only silence remained. The sun already blazed overhead, merciless. Sweat stung her eyes. Her hands throbbed in plastic cuffs. That's where it began again, where she would dislocate her thumb, snap free, and start the slow, impossible journey that would become legend. And as the memory faded, back to the present moment, her standing alone in that same desert, the sun now high again, she realized something. Everything that had gone wrong, every failure of intel, every missed cue had brought her exactly here. Alone, unarmed, dying. And yet more dangerous than she had ever been. The lieutenant thought he'd left her for dead. He'd actually put her exactly where she belonged, in a fight only she could win. How do you turn a wasteland into an ally? That question haunted Jenny Carter as the sun burned the sky white. It was noon again. The kind of noon that erased color, time, and thought. The air shimmered like molten glass. Her uniform clung to her skin, drenched in sweat that evaporated before it could fall. The desert wasn't just hot, it was alive in its cruelty, and she was learning its rhythm, one heartbeat at a time. Jenny crouched beneath a creosote bush, its fragile shade barely a relief. Her lips were cracked, her tongue swollen, every breath scraped. She rationed her strength since dawn, staying low, conserving sweat instead of fighting the heat. She knew the rules. In the desert, you don't rush, you endure. The lieutenant's laughter still echoed in her memory. Let's see how tough you are after 3 days under that sun. He thought she'd break in hours. He never met a woman who'd spent 7 years inside Delta Force. She sat with her knees pulled up, calculating silently. Her pulse was steady, but her skin was burning too fast. She needed another water source before sunset, or she wouldn't make it through the night. Her mind went back to the faint trickle she'd found the night before, that narrow canyon seep. It wouldn't last long, not with the heat climbing like this. She needed mobility, but also direction. She couldn't wander aimlessly. So she thought like an animal, like prey being hunted. She scanned the sand for movement. Small lizards darted under rocks. Ant trails ran in straight lines toward a ridge. Then a dark flicker above, birds circling in slow, deliberate arcs. They weren't vultures. They were smaller, tighter in formation. Doves or finches, maybe. Birds that needed water every few hours. Their flight path dipped southeast. Jenny smiled faintly. "Thank you," she whispered. She rose slowly, staggering at first, then steadying. Her boots sank into the soft sand. Each step cost energy, but every step mattered. The pain became distant, just background noise. She moved like a shadow across the dunes, tracing the path of life. Hours passed. The sun crawled west. Her vision swam. Heat mirages wavered in the distance like rivers she could never reach. She didn't chase them, illusions killed faster than bullets. Instead, she kept her eyes on the smallest signs. A patch of green, a change in soil color, a whiff of coolness in the air. By late afternoon, she found it a shallow basin with cracked earth and dried mud. Once a seasonal pool, now just dust, but dust could lie. She knelt and pressed her hand flat against the ground. Cool. Not cold, but cool. That meant moisture buried deep. She pulled a shard of rock from her belt, one of the makeshift blades she'd fashioned from canyon stone, and began digging. Inch by inch, the sand grew damp. Then mud. Then faintly a dark glint. Water, not much. Barely a cupful seeping upward, but enough. Jenny cupped her hands, let the liquid pool, and drank slowly. It tasted like dirt, iron, and life. She didn't care. As she drank, something shifted in her, a thought sharp and sudden. She wasn't surviving. She was learning. Every rock, every plant, every drop of water, the desert was teaching her something about patience, adaptation, invisibility. The cartel had her team, but they also had a weakness. They were bound to their well, their only water source. Without it, their strength turned to dust. A plan began to form. She sat back, breathing slow. Her skin ached, her muscles trembled, but inside her mind was clearer than ever. She started gathering. From the edges of the basin, she broke pieces of dried creosote resin, sticky, pungent, naturally antiseptic. She pocketed it. She found a barrel cactus nearby, cut into it with her stone knife, drew out liquid pulp and tasted it carefully. Bitter but safe. She wrapped the pulp in her shirt, saving it for later. Hydration and medicine in one. She worked methodically, quietly, the way she had been trained. Delta Force didn't teach survival as desperation. It taught it as math, one decision at a time, each buying a few more minutes to make the next. Panic was waste. Planning was life. By sunset, she'd built a small cache of supplies, cactus pulp, resin, sharp stones, and lengths of dried fiber twisted into rope. Primitive tools, but effective. The kind of gear that belonged to someone who refused to die efficiently. She climbed a ridge to rest as the sun dropped below the horizon. The world turned gold, then violet. Long shadows stretched across the sand. In the distance, she saw faint plumes of smoke, the cartel's compound. 90 kilometers, give or take, too far to reach without more water, but close enough that she could almost feel the danger pulsing across the earth. She sat there, watching the smoke fade with nightfall, and allowed herself a single moment of reflection. Her father had been a firefighter. He used to tell her, "Heat doesn't scare you if you understand it. It only kills the ones who panic." She remembered being a little girl, watching him come home smelling of smoke, tired but calm. She asked him once, "What's the hardest part?" He said, "Deciding which direction to run when everything's burning." That's what this was now, a fire with no water, and she had to choose her direction. Night fell fast. The stars exploded into view, sharp, brilliant, endless. The desert cooled like it was exhaling. Jenny stood, orienting by Polaris again. East, always east, toward her team, toward the mission. She began walking. The desert at night was another world, quiet, almost beautiful. The sand glowed faintly silver under starlight. Insects hummed. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote cried. She didn't fear it. It was company. Her feet blistered. Her hands bled. But her pace stayed steady, 40 steps, rest 10 seconds, repeat. She could almost hear her instructor's voice again from Delta Selection Week. Fatigue makes cowards of the unprepared. So don't get tired, get systematic. She whispered the mantra with every breath. By midnight, she spotted motion on the horizon, faint lights sweeping the desert floor. Headlights, trucks. She dropped flat, heart thudding. The cartel was still searching. Their vehicles fanned out in wide arcs, engines growling, beams cutting across dunes. They were methodical but impatient, moving too fast, wasting fuel. She smiled grimly. They expected her to crawl, delirious, easy to find. Not to be organized, not to be invisible. Jenny buried herself half under the sand, face covered, eyes just above the surface. The trucks passed less than 50 meters away. She could smell the exhaust, hear the shouts. A flashlight swept inches over her position and moved on. The desert swallowed the noise again. When she finally rose, sand poured off her shoulders. Her heart still pounded, but she was grinning now, faintly, fiercely. They'd had their chance. They missed her. She whispered into the dark, "Keep looking." By dawn, she reached another canyon, deeper this time. She could feel moisture in the air, a hint of life. She followed it down until the rock walls closed around her. There, another seep, stronger than before, a thin trickle running from a crack in the stone. She filled her hands again and drank, slower this time, savoring it like ritual. Then she got to work. She used cactus ribs to carve small containers, creosote resin to seal them. She filled each with water, barely half a liter total, but enough to move another day. She collected plant fibers, shaped crude sandals to protect her blistered feet. The canyon gave her cover, water, materials, and shade. It was more than survival now. It was preparation. The mission wasn't over. It had just evolved. By the second evening, she'd rested enough to move again. Her body felt lighter, her thoughts sharper. She ate cactus pulp for strength, adjusted her shirt into a makeshift hood, and began her trek east. The compound was still days away, but Jenny was thinking farther ahead now, not just survival but sabotage. Every man in that compound depended on that one well. If she could reach it unseen, she could end the fight before it began. Not with bullets, but with knowledge. As she walked through the night, she kept replaying what she'd seen on the satellite photos during the briefing. The position of the generator near the water well, the route the guards took to refill canteens, the rotation pattern. The pieces started aligning in her mind like a puzzle, snapping into place. Knowledge was the weapon. The desert was the delivery system. Around midnight, a faint sound stopped her cold. Engines again, but these were distant, moving slow. Patrols, probably rotating perimeter routes around the compound. She crouched low, peering across the flats. Their headlights glowed faintly, miles away. She noted their timing, the intervals, the direction. She'd use that later. She moved again once they faded. By dawn, she reached a narrow ravine lined with dark volcanic rock. It reminded her of the selection course back east, the one designed to break every candidate. Long marches, no maps, no sleep. She remembered collapsing once, thinking she'd reached her limit. The instructor had stood over her, saying, "You'll quit long before you die. Everyone does. The job is to find out how long before." Jenny smiled at the memory. "Guess we're still finding out," she murmured. She spent the next day sheltered inside the ravine, conserving energy, refining her tools. Using sharp stone edges, she carved points into sticks. She mixed cactus pulp with resin to create an adhesive compound, sticky, chemical-smelling, potent. She remembered old survival manuals mentioning toxins in desert flora, not lethal, but nauseating if ingested. Her brain clicked into operator mode. What if she used those toxins, not to kill but to disable? It wasn't war, it was asymmetry. Knowledge over firepower. By nightfall, she had her first plan, crude, dangerous, but real. Reach the compound. Contaminate their water source with concentrated cactus alkaloid. It would incapacitate without killing. They'd think it was food poisoning or heat stroke. In that confusion, she could extract her team. Simple. Impossible. Perfect. She looked at the horizon, the faint glow of the cartel's world burning under starlight, and whispered, "You left me to die. I'll make you choke on your own water instead." The desert wind carried her voice away, soft and eternal. She sat there for a long while, letting the quiet seep in. For the first time since the ambush, she wasn't just surviving, she was fighting back. And as the stars wheeled overhead, Jenny Carter, unarmed, dehydrated and sunburned, began turning the desert into a weapon no army had ever seen before. Why did the desert feel so calm on the night she decided to strike? It was the fourth night since they'd left her for dead. 4 days since heat and thirst tried to erase her name from the world. And now, under a sky so wide it looked endless, Staff Sergeant Jenny Carter was walking toward the very people who thought she couldn't survive a single afternoon. The stars burned above like scattered fires. Each step she took left no sound, no trace. She had become part of the landscape, another shadow among a million. Her skin was burned bronze, her uniform torn, her eyes dry but focused. The pain had long ago stopped feeling like pain. It had turned into clarity. She could see the compound now, faint lights trembling on the horizon. The smell of fuel drifted across the air. The distant hum of generators cut through the quiet like a pulse. That sound, that was their heartbeat, the one she planned to stop. Jenny crouched behind a low dune, pulled the damp fabric of her makeshift hood tighter, and studied the enemy through the darkness. The layout was exactly as she remembered from the satellite photos. A main building in the center, 2 smaller barracks, and the generator shack near the well. That well, it was everything. Without it, no one here lasted half a day. She waited, watching, counting. Guards moved in patterns. 2 at the north gate, one packing along the fence line, another sitting under a light smoking a cigarette. Their rhythm never changed, overconfident, predictable. She remembered something her Delta instructor had once said. "You don't need superior weapons, you need superior timing." She exhaled slowly. Timing, that was her advantage. Jenny began crawling, inch by inch. The sand was cool now, clinging to her skin. She moved with the patience of something ancient, a creature born of the desert itself. Her hands and knees left faint impressions that the wind erased as soon as they appeared. Every movement matched the rhythm of the generator's rumble, masking her sound. The fence line loomed ahead. Coiled wire. She paused, scanning. There, a drainage culvert just wide enough for a human body. She slid inside, the grit scraping her shoulders. The air smelled of oil and rot. She emerged on the other side, just 20 meters from the generator shed. A guard stood nearby, bored, leaning on his rifle, back turned. Jenny stayed frozen until he shifted his weight and looked away again. Then she moved 3 silent steps, low and smooth, crossing the space between shadows. She crouched behind the generator, the machine vibrating against her palms. The sound was deafening up close, perfect cover. She pulled a small bundle from her shirt, the cactus pulp she'd mixed with resin 2 nights ago. The smell was sharp, bitter, medicinal. She tested a trace of it earlier. It numbed her tongue instantly. A concentrated alkaloid, harmless in small doses, but in larger quantities, it would make a man wish he were dead. Nausea, dehydration, confusion, not fatal but disabling. She found the intake pipe leading to the water well and smeared the mixture across the inside seam, sealing it with resin. Then she pushed a portion deeper, letting the next pump cycle draw it down. In hours, the toxins would mix through their water supply. Jenny stayed crouched, listening. The generator roared on, indifferent. The guard yawned, spat into the dirt, and walked away. It was done, quiet, efficient, invisible. But as she turned to slip away, she froze. Voices close. 2 men approached from the opposite side, talking in low Spanish, their flashlights cutting through the dark. She flattened herself against the metal housing, heart hammering. Sweat pooled at her collar. The beam of light swept past her boot and stopped just for a second, then moved on. The men passed. One laughed about something crude. Their footsteps faded. Jenny didn't move for a full minute, not until her breathing slowed again. When she finally crawled back to the fence, the first pale hint of dawn was touching the horizon. She slipped through the culvert again, sliding across the sand until the compound was just a dark smudge behind her. She didn't smile, she didn't celebrate, she just whispered, "Phase 1 complete." Then she disappeared into the dunes. By mid-morning, the temperature was already climbing past 100 degrees. From her vantage point on a ridge 2 kilometers out, she could see the compound stirring awake. Guards walked slower now. Some stumbled. One dropped his rifle and vomited near the gate. She watched them through narrowed eyes. It was working. By noon, the pattern collapsed completely. Fighters moved erratically. Several sat in the shade holding their stomachs. A truck veered off the road and stopped. Even the radios sounded frantic, voices slurred and confused. Jenny waited, counting minutes. Her body screamed for rest, but she refused to blink. By afternoon, the compound was chaos. And inside that chaos, her team. She started moving again. Every step forward brought back flashes of them. Logan's rough humor, Nova's quiet grin, Hale's steady calm in firefights. They weren't just teammates. They were family, and she'd left them behind. The guilt cut sharper than hunger or thirst. It fueled her now. The heat hit like a hammer as she approached the outer wall. The place reeked of sickness. Men staggered near vehicles, clutching their stomachs, groaning. Some lay motionless in the dust. Jenny moved among them like a ghost, her movements deliberate, unseen. The few who saw her looked through her, too delirious to understand what they were seeing. She reached the main building's side entrance, unlocked, unattended. Inside, the air was heavy with the stench of fuel and sweat. The corridors echoed with moans and confusion. She crept along the wall, her eyes scanning every corner. Voices echoed down the hall, English faint but distinct. Her pulse surged. That was Hale. Jenny followed the sound, staying low. She reached a reinforced door, padlocked from the outside. She pressed her ear to the metal, muffled words, movement. Her team was inside. She reached into her pocket, pulled the sharp stone blade she'd carried since the canyon, and jammed it into the lock's hinge. Metal groaned. She twisted, leveraging all her weight until the pin snapped. The lock clattered to the floor. She slipped inside. They looked up, bound, battered, eyes wide. "Jenny," Hale's voice broke into disbelief. "How?" "Later," she said. Her voice was hoarse, calm. "We have to move now." Logan blinked. "You're supposed to be dead." "Not today." She crouched, cutting their restraints one by one. Can you walk? Hale nodded, barely. Good enough, everyone armed. Nova gestured weakly toward the far corner where a single guard slumped unconscious. Jenny searched him, found a sidearm, handed it to Hale. More in the armory if we make it that far. As they prepared to move, Logan asked the question anyway. What the hell happened out there? Jenny met his eyes. The desert happened, and I used it. He frowned. Used it how? She just smiled faintly. You'll see. They moved through the building, stepping over groaning cartel soldiers. The place was falling apart. Men retched in corners. Radios buzzed with incoherent chatter. Whatever remained of the command structure was gone. Jenny led them through the back hall, out toward the vehicle bay. When they reached the courtyard, the sight stopped them cold. Dozens of fighters lying in the dust, too sick to move. Others crawled toward the well, desperate for water that only made them worse. Logan muttered, "Holy, you poisoned them." Not poison, Jenny said, educated. Even in the middle of that wreckage, her tone was level, almost detached. They'll recover in a day, long enough for us to vanish. They crossed to a truck. Hale climbed behind the wheel, coughing. You planned all this alone. Jenny looked out at the dunes. No, the desert planned it, I just listened. The engine coughed to life, tires spinning through sand. As they pulled away, no one fired a shot. No one even raised a weapon. The compound shrank behind them, silent, broken, surreal. For a long moment, none of them spoke. The sound of the engine filled the cab like static. Then Hale said quietly, "You saved us." Jenny stared ahead, eyes fixed on the horizon. "No, sir, the team saved itself, I just didn't quit." Logan laughed weakly. "You and your don't quit crap." Jenny glanced at him. "It works." The border was hours away, but the air already felt lighter. The first sign of a paved road shimmered in the distance. Dust rose behind them like a wake. Hale looked at her again. "You realize what you did, Carter. You just turned survival into warfare." She thought about it for a moment. Then she said softly, "No, sir. I turned knowledge into survival." They drove in silence after that, the desert stretching out on all sides, endless, merciless, and suddenly beautiful. By the time the truck rolled across the border checkpoint, the sun was setting again. The sky glowed with streaks of orange and red, the kind of color that belonged to endings. Jenny sat in the back, watching it fade. She wasn't smiling, just breathing. In the debrief days later, analysts would argue about how she did it. They'd call it chemical warfare. They'd use words like unorthodox and unverified. But none of those words captured what really happened out there. What really happened was simple. One woman refused to die in the desert. And instead of fighting it, she listened and turned the silence itself into a weapon. The mission was over, but for Jenny Carter something deeper had begun, a quiet realization that knowledge, not strength, had carried her through. That sometimes the most dangerous weapon isn't firepower or fury. It's calm. Why was the debrief room colder than the desert? Jenny Carter sat under fluorescent lights that hummed like flies. The walls were white, the air thick with recycled conditioning, and the silence between questions felt heavier than interrogation. Across the table sat 3 men in suits and 2 officers in uniform. Their coffee had gone cold hours ago. The recorder's red light blinked steadily. She'd been back for less than 48 hours. Her skin was still raw from sunburn, her knuckles cracked, her lips healing in uneven scabs. The doctors had cleared her for questioning, though she hadn't really slept. Her body was here, but her mind still walked under the desert moon. The man in the center, gray hair, sharp eyes, the kind of face that belonged to oversight committees, leaned forward. "Sergeant Carter, can you explain how you survived 4 days in the Sierra Mars desert with no equipment, no communication, and no water?" Jenny's voice was quiet, controlled. "Training, sir, and memory." "Memory," he echoed. She nodded once. I grew up in Arizona, learned early that the desert doesn't forgive mistakes, it rewards calm. He scribbled something on a notepad. And how did you neutralize an entire cartel compound without conventional engagement? Jenny's gaze didn't waver. They relied on their well. I used the desert's resources to contaminate it temporarily. Another man leaned forward. Temporarily. Yes, sir. The compounds in desert flora cause nausea and dehydration but wear off after about 24 hours. No fatalities, minimal long-term harm. They exchanged looks. One muttered, unprecedented. Another said, unorthodox. The gray-haired man spoke again. You're aware that contaminating an enemy's water source could be interpreted as chemical warfare, Jenny finished for him. Yes, sir, but it was. I didn't use manufactured chemicals or weaponized toxins. I used nature, plants they walked past every day. Her tone was flat, unflinching. There was no pride in it, no defensiveness, only fact. Silence stretched for several beats. Then one of the officers, a colonel she didn't know, finally said, "You did what needed to be done." Jenny looked down at her bandaged hands. "I did what worked." After the debrief, they escorted her to the medical ward, a small room overlooking the base runway. Through the window, the desert stretched into distance, calm and golden. It looked the same as the one that nearly killed her, yet completely different. She watched the horizon for a long time, as if waiting for something to rise out of it. A nurse brought her water. She held the cup for a second before drinking. It was cold, painfully cold, and it hit her throat like a reminder of everything she'd lost and regained. She smiled faintly. "Guess we're even now," she whispered to the desert outside. Later, Hale visited. He stood in the doorway like a man who didn't know whether to salute or apologize. His arm was in a sling, his face bandaged, but his eyes were steady. "You look human again," he said softly. She smirked. "That's debatable." He came closer, pulling up a chair. "Intel says your little science experiment is making waves all the way to DC. They don't know whether to decorate you or classify you." Jenny took a slow sip of water, maybe both. Hale studied her for a long moment. "You saved 8 lives, Carter. You turned survival into an operation. I've seen operators pull off impossible shots, but what you did out there, no manual covers that." She looked out the window again. "Maybe it should." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "They'll study it, trust me. The whole special operations community already is. You rewrote the rule book, made everyone realize that gear doesn't make a soldier deadly. Knowledge does." Jenny was silent for a long time. Then she said quietly, "Gear fails. People panic. Nature doesn't care, it just is. If you learn how to read it, it gives you everything you need." Hale nodded slowly. "You think that lieutenant ever figured that out?" She looked at him, eyes distant. "Maybe, right before we drove away." He almost smiled. "You know command wants to keep this under wraps. No publicity, no leaks, but they're talking commendation, probably a Distinguished Service Cross, maybe higher." Jenny shook her head. "I don't need medals. I just want to make sure no one else dies because they underestimate the ground they're standing on." Hale studied her again, not like a superior officer now, but like someone seeing something rare. "You ever think about teaching?" She blinked. "Teaching what?" "What you just did. Survival under impossible conditions, turning terrain into a weapon." She gave a faint laugh. "You think anyone's crazy enough to sign up for that?" He smiled. "I know at least 3 units who would." 2 weeks later, Jenny walked onto a different kind of battlefield, a training field baked under the Kalbara sun. Rows of tents stretched into the horizon. Operators from Delta, SEALs, JTF-2, even SAS stood waiting. She wasn't in uniform. She wore a desert tan shirt, sleeves rolled, cap shading her eyes. She looked more like a geologist than a soldier. The air was dry and sharp. It smelled like dust and diesel fuel. Lieutenant Colonel Kine, head of the Joint Training Task Force, greeted her at the edge of the field. Never thought I'd see the day a Delta operator came to teach instead of fight. Jenny adjusted her pack. Never thought I'd be alive to do it. He smiled. The desert changed you. She looked at the horizon. No, it just showed me what was already there. He nodded, then stepped aside. They're all yours. Jenny walked to the front, feeling dozens of eyes on her. Most of them skeptical, battle-hardened veterans who didn't think they had anything left to learn. She didn't need to impress them. She just needed to speak truth. "The desert isn't your enemy," she began, her voice low but steady. "It's indifferent. That's what makes it powerful. It doesn't kill out of anger. It kills out of balance. Ignore its rules and you'll die. Respect them and it'll keep you alive." She paused, scanning the crowd. Everything I used to survive existed in plain sight: plants, rocks, temperature, rhythm. You can't outmuscle the environment. You adapt to it. A SEAL in the front row raised a hand. "So what's the first rule of surviving an impossible situation?" Jenny looked straight at him. "You don't survive by being strong. You survive by staying calm. Every second you spend panicking is one less second thinking." The man nodded, expression shifting from skepticism to thought. Jenny crouched and picked up a handful of dust. It flowed through her fingers like water. "This killed hundreds before you, but it also saved me. The same sand that burns your skin can cool your blood if you use it right. Every threat in this world carries its own solution if you're trained to see it." Kine watched from the sidelines, arms crossed, smiling faintly. He'd seen hundreds of instructors, none like this. Jenny didn't preach. She demonstrated. She moved like someone who'd made peace with what most people feared. Hours later, as the sun dipped low and the horizon turned gold, the operators were digging shallow pits, burying canteens in cool sand, learning evaporative cooling techniques she'd invented on instinct during those 4 days. They weren't laughing now. They were listening. Jenny stood at the edge of the field, arms folded, watching them work. Kine walked up beside her. "You changed how we teach survival," he said quietly. "Across every unit. Everyone's studying your methods now, Australians, Brits, Canadians. You started a doctrine." Jenny smiled faintly. "Because they're realizing something important. Survival isn't toughness, it's knowledge." He nodded slowly. "You ever think about what that lieutenant said, out in the desert? That Delta doesn't run from death." Jenny looked at the setting sun, her expression unreadable. He was right, but he misunderstood what that means. "How so?" She turned to him, voice calm and clear. "Delta doesn't run from death, not because we're fearless, but because we understand fear. We know what it's trying to teach." Kine's face softened. "He told the team we got him in a follow-up operation. He couldn't believe you lived, said it wasn't human." Jenny's eyes flicked toward the horizon. It wasn't superhuman either, just training and stubbornness. She watched a dust devil spin across the field, scattering sand into the sky. "The desert didn't make me special. It just showed what Delta built in me, the ability to keep thinking when everything goes wrong." Kine was quiet for a moment. "Most candidates quit during selection." 90%, she said, "because they think they're there to become superhuman. They're not. They're there to learn they're human, and that's enough if you know what to do with it." He smiled slightly. "You ever regret it, not giving up?" Jenny shook her head. "No, sir. Regret is for people who still think they had a choice." The sun sank behind the dunes, leaving the sky glowing amber and violet. The air cooled, wind whispering across the training ground. Kine turned to go, but Jenny stayed still, staring at the horizon, the same line of light she once crawled toward, dying and alone. She whispered softly, almost to herself, "Sometimes dignity doesn't speak, it just acts." The words drifted away into the wind, carried out across the endless desert that had tried and failed to bury her. Why would anyone go back into another wasteland? after nearly dying in one? That was the question the brass kept asking her, quietly, behind closed doors, as if they couldn't understand why she'd volunteer for another mission in a place just as hostile as the last. Jenny Carter never answered directly. She'd just say, because unfinished work doesn't finish itself. 3 months had passed since the Sierra Mars incident. 3 months of lectures, reports, training programs, and quiet recognition from people who didn't use applause. Her survival course had already been integrated into special operations manuals. Analysts had dissected every move she made in the desert, building simulations and checklists, trying to capture in procedure what she'd done by instinct. But Jenny wasn't built for classrooms. She didn't belong in air-conditioned facilities with PowerPoint slides explaining her ordeal. She belonged where silence hummed, where thinking fast mattered more than talking well. So when the next assignment came, a joint operation in southern Africa, she didn't hesitate. The terrain was brutal. Arid plains stretching hundreds of miles, fractured ridgelines, and heat that could cook a man in his armor. The target, a warlord's trafficking network that had taken over a stretch of the Namib Fringe, using it as a corridor for weapons and captives. Intelligence was thin. The risks were high. The operation would need insertion by air, exfil by faith, and survival skills no one else on the roster possessed. Command called it Operation Hollow Dune. Jenny called it another test. She arrived at the forward base before dawn. The camp was half tents, half dust storms. Soldiers moved like ghosts through the haze, their gear already coated in grit. Jenny stepped off the transport plane with a rucksack slung over her shoulder and a quiet focus in her eyes. She wasn't the same woman who'd been left to die months ago. She was sharper, quieter, somehow more still. Colonel Hale was there to greet her. He'd been reassigned from Sierra Mars Command to oversee joint field operations. "Didn't think I'd see you back in a sandbox so soon," he said, smiling faintly. Jenny adjusted her pack. "You told me once to trust my training." "And now you're the one people are quoting in classrooms," Hale said, shaking his head. "You're a myth already." "Then let's make sure the myth still works." He led her into the operations tent. Maps covered the walls, marking choke points, ridges, and potential routes through the wasteland. The team was small, a mix of Delta, British SAS, and South African Special Recon. Experienced operators, but none who knew this terrain like she did. At the center stood Lieutenant Colonel Kine, her old colleague from the survival program. He nodded when she entered. "Good to see you again, Carter." "You too, sir," she said. He gestured to the map. "Our target is here, a fortified compound in the Kalbara sector. Intelligence suggests they're moving hostages and heavy ordnance through this route. Locals call it the Red Throat Deep Canyon System, narrow, high cliffs, perfect place for an ambush." Jenny studied the terrain lines. The map showed elevation changes like scars. She traced the ridges with her finger. "Looks like the desert you warned them about," she murmured. Kine nodded. "Heat here's different, denser. You can't breathe it, you chew it." Hale folded his arms. "That's why you're here, Carter. You understand environments like this. You don't just survive in them, you think through them." Jenny's eyes stayed on the map. "What's the mission window?" 3 days, Kine said. "Insertion before dawn, movement through Red Throat, reconnaissance on the compound. If confirmed, we exfil and call in an airstrike." Jenny nodded slowly. "Understood." As the briefing ended, Kine caught her before she left. "You sure you're ready, after what happened?" She met his eyes, calm, unblinking. "That's exactly why I'm ready." They inserted before dawn. The desert was silver under moonlight, winds cutting low across the plains. Jenny felt the helicopter's rotors shake through her chest as they dropped into darkness. The moment boots hit sand, the world went silent again, just like before. The team moved out, 8 shadows against a landscape that didn't care if they lived or died. By noon, the heat turned savage. The ground shimmered like metal. Even the wind felt heavy. Jenny checked the team's pace, steady but slowing. One operator, a young Brit named Lorne, stumbled briefly. She caught his arm. "Hydration rhythm," she said quietly. "Don't sip constantly. Small bursts every 30 minutes. You'll lose more through breathing than sweat." He nodded, embarrassed. "Right, sorry, ma'am." "Don't apologize to me. Apologize to your kidneys later," she said with a faint grin. Hale overheard and smirked. "Still teaching on the move, huh?" Jenny adjusted her scarf. "Some lessons can't wait." They reached the first ridge by late afternoon. Below lay the Red Throat, a labyrinth of stone and shadow, twisting for miles. The air inside it looked cooler, but Jenny knew better. Heat pooled in those canyons like invisible fire. "This is where it starts," she said, scanning the rocks. "We move through at night." Hale nodded. "Set camp, minimal signature." As the sun dropped, the team settled in. Jenny moved to the edge of the ridge, sitting cross-legged, eyes on the horizon. The sky bled orange, then purple, then black. The first stars appeared, sharp and cold. She breathed slowly, feeling the rhythm of the land, the hum, the silence, the way the air shifted temperature minute by minute. The desert was alive again. Different continent, same lesson. She closed her eyes and whispered, "All right, old friend. Let's see what you've got this time." Night movement was grueling. The canyon narrowed fast. The walls pressed close, towering above them. Their flashlights stayed off, only moonlight guided them. The ground underfoot was uneven, littered with shards of rock. Every sound bounced off the walls and came back louder. Jenny led the point. Her movements were methodical, balanced. Every step felt like a test of memory. She could almost hear her own voice from months ago: "Stay calm. Move smart. Think ahead." By 200 hours, they reached a bend overlooking the enemy compound, floodlights in the distance, faint movement, faint music. Through night optics, she counted at least 24 guards, heavy vehicles, and a watchtower near the canyon mouth. Hale crouched beside her. "What's your read?" "They're not expecting anyone from this side," Jenny whispered. "The terrain's too rough. They'll think no one's crazy enough to come through Red Throat." "Guess we found our entry point," Hale said quietly. She didn't answer. Her eyes stayed on the lights. Something bothered her, a pattern she couldn't yet see. The way the guards shifted positions, the irregular timing of the patrols. It wasn't random. It was organized chaos. "They're baiting movement," she realized aloud, "waiting for someone to probe the edge." "How sure are you?" Hale asked. Jenny frowned, sure enough to call it a trap. Before she could finish the thought, a sharp crack echoed, not gunfire but something else. A flare burst overhead, flooding the canyon in red light. "Move," Hale shouted. Bullets ripped through the air. The cliffs exploded in dust. The team dove for cover. Jenny hit the ground, rolling behind a rock. Sparks flew inches from her face. "Contact left, high ridge," someone yelled. She grabbed her carbine, scanning the cliffs. The enemy had height and numbers. Perfect kill zone, exactly what she'd feared. She fired 3 quick shots, then ducked again as debris showered around her. "Fallback point," Hale ordered through comms. "Route Delta." But Jenny's instincts screamed something else. The canyon would collapse into a bottleneck ahead. If they ran blind, they'd be pinned again. They needed another way, something the enemy couldn't predict. Her eyes darted to the side, a narrow split between rocks. Tight, dark, almost invisible in the shadows. A dry runoff channel, maybe 10 feet high. She shouted over the noise, "There, cut right." Hale saw it and nodded, "Go." They moved in bursts, covering one another. The channel swallowed them whole, narrow, claustrophobic, but safe from direct fire. The sounds of battle echoed overhead, then began to fade. They'd broken contact, barely. Breathing hard, Jenny leaned against the wall, sweat mixing with dust. Her hands trembled for a moment before she forced them still. Lorne looked shaken. How the hell did you see that gap? She gave him a faint smile. I stopped looking at the fight and started looking at the ground. Hale grinned between breaths. You and your damn environment. Jenny shrugged. It's never let me down. They regrouped, checked ammo, and moved deeper into the channel. It wound through the rocks until it opened into a small hollow, a natural shelter, perfect for regrouping. They set perimeter and waited for calm silence. The firefight above died away. Jenny crouched, tracing her hand through the sand. They knew we were coming. Someone leaked intel. Hale nodded grimly. Agreed. Kine's voice crackled faintly through the radio. Team Bravo status. Alive, Hale replied. Ambush avoided, adjusting route. Jenny added quietly, no time to rest. They'll circle back by dawn. We move before they do. The others looked at her, tired, dust-covered, drained. But no one questioned her. Not anymore. They moved again under the dying stars. The desert wind howled through the canyon, cold now, cutting through their gear. Jenny led them up a steep slope until the world opened wide again, the endless plains of Kalbara stretching toward the horizon. The first light of dawn touched the ridges. Hale came up beside her, breathing hard. You think the desert, trying to kill you again. Jenny stared at the sun rising. No, it's just testing me. He chuckled softly, and... She looked at him, eyes steady. I'm still passing. For a moment they stood there, two silhouettes against the light, surrounded by silence that wasn't empty anymore. It was alive. By mid-morning they'd found new cover behind a rock formation. Jenny crouched, studying the terrain through binoculars. The compound still lay miles ahead, but now the pattern made sense. The enemy had sensors, buried heat traps that detected body temperature. Technology, not intuition. She lowered the binoculars, a quiet smirk forming. You can't fight nature with machines, she murmured. The land always wins. Hale glanced over. What's the play? Jenny looked back at the ridge. We make the land our cover. How? She gestured toward the sand. We bury our heat, move cold. He frowned. Bury. She was already kneeling, digging into the sand's cooler layer, showing him. Desert crust holds heat. 2 inches down, it's 20 degrees lower. Cover yourself with it, your signature vanishes. Hale nodded slowly. You're serious. I'm alive, aren't I? They began prepping masking gear, adjusting packs, smearing dust over their exposed skin. The technique was primitive, absurd, and brilliant. Jenny's desert logic again. The kind of thinking that turned science into survival. As they moved out again, invisible under the rising sun, one thought kept circling in Hale's mind. The same thought that had crossed every commander's desk since Sierra Mars. This woman doesn't just survive environments, she rewrites them. Why do the worst betrayals always come from silence? Jenny Carter had learned long ago that death usually announced itself in footsteps, in metal clicks, in the distant hiss of danger. But betrayal, that arrived without sound. It hid behind still faces, behind trust, behind uniforms that looked just like yours. The sun had barely cleared the ridges when she felt it, that quiet, crawling sense that something was wrong. The team was moving through a narrow stretch of open desert, the ground cracked and hard from years without rain. Ahead, the air shimmered. Behind, nothing but the line of their own footprints. And yet something didn't fit. Jenny slowed her pace. Hale noticed first. What is it? She raised a hand. Stop. The team froze. Wind whispered through the silence. She crouched, pressing her palm against the ground. The sand was still cool, early enough that heat hadn't buried their scent. But there were faint indentations nearby, not theirs. Tire tracks fresh. Someone had been here not long ago. She straightened, eyes narrowing. We've got company, and they know where we are. Hale's jaw tightened. Impossible, we're off the grid. Jenny glanced at him. Then someone put us back on. They scanned the horizon, but the world looked empty. That was the problem. The desert never showed its hand, it waited. She could almost feel eyes watching from the ridges. Her mind worked fast. They'd avoided the ambush in Red Throat because of her instincts. But if the enemy still tracked them, it meant someone had leaked positions, comms frequencies, routes, maybe mission windows. Who had access to the op details? She asked sharply. Hale frowned. Only command and insertion crew. Jenny's eyes hardened. Command's not out here. For a second no one spoke. Then Kine's voice crackled faintly over comms. Team Bravo, status check. Jenny's thumb hovered over the transmitter but didn't press it. The timing was too perfect. Her instincts screamed. Hale keyed in instead. We're mobile, no contact. Static, then Kine's voice again, calm but clipped. Copy that. Adjust route north, there's a storm system moving in. Jenny stared at the transmitter. North. The map replayed in her head. North led to an open salt pan, no cover for 20 kilometers. South had caves and ridges. North meant exposure, death. She shook her head. No, that's wrong. Hale frowned. Maybe Intel updated. Or maybe Intel's the trap, she said quietly. He hesitated. He'd seen her instincts save them before. He didn't doubt them now. Then where? South, she said. We stick to the rock line. The storm's not our enemy. The people watching us are. He nodded once. Move. They veered south, away from the open plains, keeping low. Within minutes, the wind began to shift, first a breeze, then a roar. The sky darkened, the horizon blurring. Sand lifted in curtains, rolling toward them like smoke. A sandstorm massive and fast. Shelter, Hale shouted. They ran for the nearest ridge, stumbling through wind and grit. The air turned solid with dust. Jenny's scarf whipped around her face. The world vanished into orange chaos. Every breath burned like glass. They reached a rocky outcrop just as the storm hit full force. The ground shook. Visibility dropped to zero. Jenny dropped to the ground, pulling her scarf tighter, pressing against the wall of the ridge. Hale crouched beside her. We hold here. For now, she shouted through the wind. Storm's cover, use it. The team huddled together, waiting it out. The wind howled like an animal, erasing every trace of the world outside. Jenny felt her heartbeat sink with the roar, chaotic, relentless, alive. Minutes stretched into hours. When the storm finally began to ease, they emerged coated in dust, eyes stinging. The world was unrecognizable, dunes shifted, tracks erased, the sky washed pale. But something glinted in the distance. Jenny squinted. Metal half buried in sand, a wrecked truck. She walked toward it, rifle ready. The wind hissed around her boots. When she reached it, she saw bullet holes along the side recent. The inside reeked of fuel and death. 2 bodies slumped over the seats, warlord insignia. But behind them, something worse. An American comms unit. Jenny froze. The serial code matched their own operations issue. She climbed into the truck, checked the logs. The last transmission, outgoing, encrypted, 5 hours before their ambush. Her chest tightened. Whoever had sent it used a code clearance only command officers carried. Someone had fed the enemy their route. She stared at the data for a long moment, dust swirling around her. Then she turned and called to Hale. We've got a leak, confirmed. He joined her, eyes scanning the wreckage. His expression hardened. Command compromised. Someone near the top, she said. Maybe even Kine. Hale cursed under his breath. That son of. Jenny cut him off. We can't prove it yet, but if we transmit anything, we're done. From now on, no comms, we move dark. He nodded grimly. Copy that. They buried the transmitter in sand, erasing their signal trail. Then they moved again, slower now, more careful. Jenny led, scanning every shadow. Trust had become fragile. By nightfall, they reached a narrow pass that overlooked the compound again, this time from a different angle. Jenny crouched with her scope, observing. Something had changed below. More vehicles, more lights, reinforcements. "They're expecting us," she whispered. "Whoever fed them intel, they're still talking." Hale exhaled sharply. "Then we finish this before they can." Jenny nodded, her mind already calculating. She survived worse odds, but this was different. The mission had turned into something personal, not revenge but responsibility. The same kind that had kept her alive in Sierra Mars. She looked at the men beside her, tired, dust-covered, silent. They were watching her now, waiting. She wasn't the highest in rank, but everyone deferred to her instinctively. She earned that kind of quiet command, not through shouting, but through surviving. She outlined the plan in low tones. "We hit the compound at 300, minimal noise, disable their vehicles first. Then we secure the hostages, exfil through the ridge corridor." "Same as Sierra Mars," Hale noted. Jenny gave a faint smile. "Almost. This time we know the desert's watching." They rested in shifts until the stars wheeled overhead. The air cooled sharply, carrying the smell of distant fuel. Jenny sat apart from the others, checking her gear, when Hale joined her. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "Sure." He hesitated, then said quietly, "Do you ever get tired of surviving?" She looked up at him, eyes shadowed by starlight. "All the time, but surviving isn't the point, sir. It's what you do after that matters." He nodded slowly. "And what are you doing after this?" Jenny looked out toward the horizon, that endless dark line she'd followed across 2 deserts now. "Maybe I'll finally rest. Or maybe the world will find another storm to throw me into." Hale smiled faintly. "It always does." She didn't answer, just tightened her gear straps and stared into the dark until the first hint of dawn began to bleed into the sky. The attack came quiet. No shouting, no heroics, just purpose. Jenny led them down the ridge under the last shadows of night. The sand muffled their steps. The air was cold enough to sting. She could feel her pulse in her fingertips, steady, measured, alive. The first sentry never saw her. One clean strike, silent, final. She moved like memory, precise, invisible. Her team mirrored her rhythm, clearing each post without a single gunshot. By the time the first alarm finally sounded, they were already inside the perimeter. "Go," she hissed. They moved fast through the maze of shacks and vehicles. Jenny's eyes locked on the main tent near the central generator, the power hub. The one place she knew could end this entire compound in seconds. She ducked inside, found the fuel drums, the jerrycans stacked like dominoes. She uncoiled det cord, setting it low and tight. The hum of electricity filled the silence. It reminded her of another generator, another desert, another night when she'd been left for dead. She smiled faintly. Let's see if history likes irony. Outside, shouts erupted. Gunfire cracked. The world exploded back into noise. "Contact," Logan's voice cut through the radio. "They're up." Jenny hit the detonator. The explosion rolled like thunder, fire flashing across the sky. The compound plunged into chaos. She ran toward the prison block, smoke and heat licking the air. Hale's voice came through, low and controlled. "Get the hostages." She reached the steel door, blew the lock with a breaching charge, and stepped inside. 3 civilians, gaunt, terrified, alive. "Delta Force," she said calmly. "We're getting you home." They followed her without hesitation. Outside, the firefight raged, but confusion had splintered the enemy. Vehicles burned, men shouted, some retreating blindly into the dunes. Jenny moved through the smoke like a shadow, leading the hostages toward the extraction point. Hale's team covered their rear. A bullet struck the ground inches from her foot. Another whizzed past her ear. She ducked, firing 2 quick bursts. The assailant fell, his rifle clattering across the dirt. The hostages stumbled ahead. Jenny pushed them forward. "Keep moving, don't stop." When they finally reached the ridge, the first light of dawn broke behind them. The desert glowed red, a color that felt like blood and rebirth all at once. They collapsed behind cover, dust, smoke, silence. Hale caught his breath looking at her. We did it. Jenny scanned the horizon. The compound burned below, the hostages were safe, but something still felt wrong, unfinished. We did, she said softly, but someone up the chain didn't want us to. Hale followed her gaze. You think Kine? She didn't answer, just whispered, we'll find out soon. The wind shifted, carrying the smoke away. Jenny stood slowly, the rising sun painting her face in gold and ash. Her eyes looked distant, like she was already somewhere else. A part of her was back in that first desert where silence had tried to kill her, and she'd learned that survival wasn't luck. It was choice. The world had tried to bury her twice now. And both times, she'd come back carrying the ground itself as a weapon. Why do some battles end, only to keep echoing? The mission in Kalbara was over. The hostages were safe. The compound was gone. But for Jenny Carter, peace didn't come with the extraction helicopter. It came later in fragments, in the hum of engines, in the silence no one dared to fill. She sat across from Hale in the transport bird, her face half-shadowed by the rising sun. The wind from the open hatch whipped through the cabin, catching loose strands of her hair. She looked tired but not broken. There was a stillness in her now, like she'd finally made peace with something the desert had been trying to tell her all along. Hale leaned back, eyes closed. Command waiting for us at base, he said quietly. Said it's urgent. Jenny didn't respond. She was watching the horizon again, that endless stretch of gold and blue. Hale studied her for a moment. You think it was Kine, don't you? She didn't look away from the window. I think someone out there wanted to make sure we didn't come back. He sighed, and yet here we are. She gave a faint smile. That's what Delta does best. The helicopter shuddered as it approached the landing strip. Down below, rows of tents and armored trucks waited. Dust kicked up in waves as they touched down. Jenny felt the shift in air pressure, familiar, sterile. The moment she stepped off the ramp, she knew something was wrong. Too quiet. Too many eyes watching. And Kine was there. He stood near the hangar entrance, arms folded, expression unreadable. The wind caught the edge of his uniform jacket, flicking dust across the ground. Hale noticed too. You feel that? Jenny nodded, like the air before a shot. They approached together. Kine's voice carried through the wind. Good work, Sergeant Carter. You completed the objective. Jenny stopped a few feet away. No thanks to command. He tilted his head slightly. What's that supposed to mean? She studied him, calm, controlled. We were ambushed twice. Both times at locations only headquarters had access to. Someone fed them our routes. Kine didn't flinch. That's a serious accusation. Not an accusation, she said softly. A fact. For a moment, silence. Then Kine smiled faintly. You always did have a flair for dramatics. Hale stepped forward. We found one of our comm units in a cartel truck, transmitting under your clearance code. That wiped the smile from Kine's face. He blinked once, his jaw tightening. Impossible. Jenny's eyes didn't move. Nothing's impossible in the desert, sir. You of all people should know that. A long beat passed. The wind hissed between them. Then Kine exhaled slowly, almost wearily. You think I sold you out, but you don't understand. This was bigger than one operation. Jenny frowned. Enlighten me. Kine looked past her toward the horizon. Washington wanted results, proof of efficiency, funding, been on the line for years. The higher-ups decided one controlled loss would justify a bigger intervention. I didn't volunteer you, Carter, but when your name came up, they didn't stop it. Jenny's stomach tightened, so they left us as bait. He didn't deny it. You survived, you became a symbol, the system got its funding, everyone won. Her voice turned cold. Not everyone. Kyne's gaze hardened. You think they care about fairness. You think the machine stops because a few good soldiers die. Hale took a step forward, fury in his voice. You played God with lives. Kyne turned to him. Don't pretend outrage. You've been in this long enough to know every mission has a price. Jenny's voice cut through, steady and low. Then maybe it's time someone stops paying it in silence. For the first time, Kyne's composure cracked. He stepped closer, his voice sharp. You don't know what you're talking about. She met his stare, unflinching. No, I know exactly what I'm talking about. They stood there, the survivor and the strategist, two sides of the same war. One human, one institutional. Hale finally broke the silence. Command will hear about this. Kyne's expression shifted. You think they'll believe you over me? Jenny's reply came like a whisper. I don't need them to believe me. I just need them to remember me. He frowned. And what does that mean? She took a slow step forward. It means when this happens again, and it will, they'll think twice before using one of their own as disposable. Kyne's jaw flexed, but he said nothing. Jenny turned away. Hours later in the debrief room, Jenny sat alone again, the same hum of fluorescent lights, the same recorder blinking red. But this time there were no questions, just forms, reports, silence. Her statement was concise, precise, clinical. She didn't accuse anyone by name. She didn't dramatize events. She let the facts breathe for themselves like the desert, unembellished, unforgiving, and true. When she finished, she signed the last page and stood. The colonel on duty looked up from his papers. Sergeant, what will you do now? Jenny paused. Rest. He nodded. You've earned it. But she didn't go to quarters. Instead, she walked out toward the airfield, where the wind still carried the smell of dust and fuel. A small hangar stood at the edge, half forgotten. Inside, a row of unmarked crates, a map board, and a flag folded neatly on a shelf. She sat on a crate and closed her eyes. For the first time in weeks, she let herself feel tired. Days passed. The world moved on. Reports filed, commendations processed, news releases sanitized. The story of Delta's desert ghost spread quietly through the ranks, the woman who turned sand into strategy. No official medal, no parade, but in the small corners of special operations, her name was whispered like a code word for endurance. A legend born not from victory, but from survival. Jenny kept to herself. She trained new recruits. She spoke rarely. She moved like someone carrying an invisible weight, not heavy enough to break her, but enough to remind her what she'd paid to stay alive. Sometimes she'd wake before dawn, walk out to the perimeter fence, and just stare at the horizon. The sky would bleed from violet to gold, and she'd feel that same pulse under her skin, the one that had guided her through every mission. The one that said, "You're still here, keep moving." Hale visited one morning, coffee in hand. "You look better in sunlight," he said softly. She smiled faintly. Sunlight doesn't judge. He leaned on the fence beside her. They're calling it a success. The Pentagon's spinning it as a demonstration of adaptive field leadership. Jenny sipped her coffee. They can call it whatever they want. We know what it was. He nodded. You ever think of writing it down? She shook her head. Some stories don't belong on paper. Hale studied her profile, calm, distant, grounded. So what now? Jenny watched the horizon. I keep teaching. Someone has to show them how to survive more than the enemy. He smiled. You mean the system? She didn't answer, just stared into the sunrise. Weeks later, a new class assembled on the training ground. Recruits from all over, some wide-eyed, some jaded, all curious. Jenny stood before them in the desert heat, sleeves rolled, cap low. Her tone was simple, steady, patient. The first rule of survival, she said, isn't about water or food. It's about truth. You can't lie to yourself and live. They listened, silent. The second rule, fear isn't your enemy, it's your compass. Listen to it, but don't let it drive. She paused, watching their faces. Some nodded, some frowned, all thinking. Then she said softly, "The last rule, and this one's not in the manual, is this. If the world leaves you behind, don't wait to be rescued. Become the reason someone else makes it home." The wind caught her words and carried them into the distance. Behind her, the recruits began their drills, digging, sweating, learning. Jenny turned toward the horizon again. The light shimmered over the dunes, familiar and infinite. A smile touched her lips, the kind that held both sadness and peace. The desert had tried to bury her twice. Instead, it had carved her into something unbreakable. She whispered quietly, as if to the wind itself, "You were never my enemy. You were my teacher." The wind shifted, soft, approving. Hale watched from afar. He saw her standing there alone, but not lonely, and understood what so few ever did. Jenny Carter didn't fight to be remembered. She fought so others could forget fear. And maybe that was her final mission. Months later, her name surfaced again in a classified memo. Recommendation: Delta Survival Doctrine Integration, codename Carter Protocol. No fanfare, no speech, just a legacy quietly written into the manual of every operator who would ever step into the dust. Her fingerprints everywhere, invisible but permanent. Some called her a ghost. Others called her a myth. But those who knew her, really knew her, said something simpler. She just refused to quit. And maybe that was enough. Because in the end, Jenny Carter didn't need the world to know her story. She just needed it to remember the lesson she left behind. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts.